It seems that Scott M. Sullivan has stopped doing his quick tips for arguing with atheists. Maybe he's realized just how ridiculous they really are, and after all, there's a lot of people calling him out on his apologetic bullshit. It's funny, and I don't know what this means, or if there's another explanation, but just looking over his viewership numbers as his quick tips go on, the number of views has fallen dramatically over time. With these tips going the way of the dodo, I figured I'd just get them out of the way and address the last 3 tips in one go. So let's get started.
Hey guys, Scott Sullivan here with tip number 7 now on how to argue with an atheist. Okay, so quick tip number 7 now on how to argue with an atheist is that you have to learn the arguments for the existence of God. You have to learn these well. Obviously, this sort of thing is key in this kind of discussion. You have to learn what I think are the 3 main arguments, the big 3 of the traditional arguments for the existence of God.
But before we get to his big 3, let's back up for a second. It's clear that he's not really serious that he wants anyone to learn these arguments, just like he wasn't serious when he said he wants apologists to learn how to use logic. In learning about these arguments, in looking at them logically, anyone with any integrity is going to find out that none of these arguments hold any water whatsoever. If he thinks they do, he's out of his frickin' gourd, which is probably the case anyway. So let's see what he's so proud of, shall we?
Namely, the first cause argument, why there can't be an infinite regress of causes that has to stop at a first cause, and why that first cause must be one, immaterial, and personal.
Seriously, they're still pushing that one, huh? The problem with the first cause argument is that God, by definition, has to violate the argument. You can't just arbitrarily claim that God is the first cause that had no cause himself. Well, then why can't we just declare that the universe had no cause? Or wherever the universe came from. After all, it really is arbitrary. There's no evidence for any of this, and it's just something that a theist pulls straight out of their ass. Now, I want you to remember something here because we're going to talk about it in a few minutes. The first cause argument only finds that there has to be an uncaused cause. It says nothing whatsoever about what that uncaused cause has to be, and this is important.
Learn that argument. Also the design argument that shows there must be a designer of the universe.
That's a sad argument as well because ultimately there's nothing to it. There's no reason to think that the natural world had a designer. This is really just the argument from ignorance. They can't understand how stuff got there, therefore they're going to believe that it had to come from a creator. Again, please note that the creator is not defined.
Also the moral argument that shows there must be a moral lawgiver or governor of the universe.
Since there's no reason other than wishful thinking to conclude that objective morality exists at all, this also has to be thrown away into the morass of religious absurdity. All 3 of these arguments are just religious delusion, and yet again, we have another undefined claim.
I think these 3 arguments are indeed very powerful.
But they're not. And I'll tell you why. Even if all 3 of them were logically valid, and they're not, but let's assume for the moment that they are, none of them get you from these vague, undefined concepts to the factual existence of Scott Sullivan's particular version of the Christian God. None of them. Now, all of them are just bald assertions with no rational support, but Christian apologists are infamous for pulling crap like this, making what sounds like reasonable assertions, then skipping down the primrose path to claiming that it wasn't just this undefined, unsupported, non-evaluated thing. It actually has to be their particular deity that is responsible. How did you get from point A to B? Show me your steps. They can't. At least not intellectually. But if you bring it up, either they're going to ignore you, or they're going to claim that this is where faith comes in. Faith, I hate to say it, is not a credible way of finding things out about the world. And just wishing really, really hard doesn't get you to an intellectually valid conclusion. Even if the original assertions could be supported, which, of course, they cannot.
Now, where are you going to learn these sorts of things? Well, there are a couple of places. Obviously, there are a lot of books. One book I recommend is Brian Davies' book. This is a good book, I think, for beginners. I used to use this book when I taught philosophy at the university. This is an introduction to the philosophy of religion. He goes into these issues. It's a good, I think, introduction for beginners on these issues and other issues too, because he goes not only into the arguments, but also a lot of the main objections against them. So this is a good introductory read.
And that's kind of the problem. If you have to specify that your philosophical surveys are only on religion, that you cannot simply follow the established laws of logic and rules of reason, you have to specifically bend them to your religious perspective, you're automatically doing something wrong. You don't see people pushing the philosophy of astrology or the philosophy of ghosts as a credible field of study, and no critical thinker is going to let them get away with pushing such a clearly biased ideology in any kind of debate. If the point is to argue with atheists, which is what these videos are supposed to help provide, then you have to argue from a common ground where faith and emotion are not permitted, and everyone has to operate from the same perspective. That's why these arguments never go well, because the apologists are often some kind of crazy la-la land.
Also, I have courses on this topic. I've got courses at my website on the video courses on how to prove the existence of God. So these are classes where I defend these arguments. But wherever you get the information, please get it somewhere, because this kind of thing is so very important. It is crucial when you are dialoguing with an atheist.
Of course, he gets right to trying to sell you something. And let's be honest, given the kind of piss-poor performance he's had in these quick tips, is anyone with half a clue going to hand over money to this guy and let him defend his faith? I know I certainly wouldn't, even if I was the kind of gullible religious zealot that he's clearly making these videos for. But hey, maybe he'll turn it around in the end. Let's go look at his quick tip number 8.
Okay, so quick tip number 8 now on how to argue with an atheist is to remember the difference between arguments for God versus arguments for Christianity. These are two separate subjects. They have two different lines of supporting argumentation, and don't get them confused. I promise you that when you get in a dialogue with an atheist, they're going to confuse these things. You'll be given an argument for the existence of God, and you'll get a response like, oh, but that doesn't prove Christianity is true. And on the other hand, you'll be talking about the historical evidence for the truth of Christianity and the divinity of Jesus. You'll be given an argument for that, and someone will respond, oh, but that doesn't prove God exists. But these are two different subjects with two different lines of argumentation. We have two different tools we use here. We have a whole set of arguments for the existence of God on one hand, and we have a different independent set of arguments for the truth of Christianity. So you have to keep these two subjects distinct, because people will get them confused.
You know, he actually has a point here, if you can believe it, at least to a certain degree. The existence of a God, any God, and the validity of Christianity or another religion, or the version of Christianity, those are two very different questions, and I think he's done well to point it out. Unfortunately, since the validity of Christianity rests entirely on the existence of God, I don't know how many points that actually wins him, because it doesn't do any good to argue for the validity of Catholicism, for instance, until you've demonstrated that there's any good reason to think that God exists. The apologist needs to remember that just because a particular line of argument convinces them that what they already believe is so, that doesn't mean it's going to convince anyone else, somebody who doesn't already believe it and is looking at it from the outside. There's a significant confirmation bias at play in religion. People for whom belief is already a given are going to be biased toward any argument that purports to support their pre-existing beliefs, even if the argument itself is poor in quality or illogical in merit. While I certainly am not going to give quick tips on how to argue with atheists, I do recommend not even bothering with the validity of the religion until they've gotten around to proving the existence of the deity upon which the religion is based. That means you'll never, ever talk to a theist about their church, because they will never be able to get over that initial hurdle. But that was the end of Quick Tip 8. So let's go on to number 9.
Okay, so quick tip number 9 here on how to argue with an atheist is for your own peace of mind, really, is that you have to remember that not everybody is going to be convinced, and that's okay. I mean, no one in the history of philosophy has ever given an argument that just bowls everybody over and convinces everybody. That's just not going to happen. So you have to realize that no matter how good your arguments are, you can have the perfect argument, and lay it out there, and someone can still say in response, "Oh, I don't buy it. I don't accept it. That's silly." That's just the nature of the case. We are human beings. We have free will, and someone can say whatever they want.
So in other words, you're going to fail a lot because lots of atheists are going to take one look at your ridiculous arguments and laugh in your face. Yes, it is true that for any argument, no matter how logically valid or invalid it might be, there are people who are going to reject it because they're unwilling to deal with it. It's almost always emotion that forms a barrier to accepting good, logically sound arguments, but it is almost always intellect that stops people from buying into ridiculous religious bullshit. It is important for atheists to remember that they shouldn't just say, "I reject your claims," and walk away. They need to actually explain why they reject them, why they are bad arguments, and why they have failed to meet their burden of proof. The theist most likely won't care why you rejected their arguments because they didn't accept them intellectually to begin with, and you can't argue with blind faith and unshakable zealotry.
St. Thomas Aquinas said that no truth is so evident that it can't be denied, at least orally. I mean, you can't give an argument and keep those words from coming out of someone's mouth like, "Oh, that's silly, I don't buy that." You can't do that. So I think you just have to be content with that fact. We can know that there are good, powerful arguments for the existence of God, and that's true whether or not everybody accepts it or not. I mean, after all, Christ himself, he didn't convince everybody, and so you're not going to either. So please, for your own peace of mind, be content with the fact that we have good arguments for the existence of God, but that's not going to convince everybody.
But likewise, having your supposedly good arguments pointed out as very bad arguments, that isn't going to convince the faithful because they really couldn't care less if what they believe is wrong. They believe for purely emotional reasons, and whenever their emotional comfort is challenged, they curl up in a little ball and hug their Bibles, believing that if they stick their fingers in their ears and clench their eyes shut tightly enough, everything will be okay. That is, without a doubt, the least rational thing that anyone can possibly do, but for anyone who has any experience debating theists, and I certainly have, that is the end result 99.9% of the time. So what did you think? You know why I don't take Scott Sullivan seriously in any of this? Because if he had any actual tips for arguing with atheists, he'd be out arguing with atheists. He wouldn't be sitting on YouTube making videos for the faithful trying to sell books and classes. He'd be out there practicing what he preaches. You know what they say, those who can do, those who can't teach. Clearly, Sullivan can't. Thanks for sticking with me through these quick tips. I have no idea if he'll ever do any more. If someone sees more show up on his page, please let me know at this email address. While you're at it, make sure you like, subscribe, and share this video. Maybe it will fall into the hands of a reasonable theist who will learn just how ridiculous this stuff is. We can only hope, right?